You have gone quiet, not recently, though it may feel recent to you. The quiet completed some time ago, beneath the ordinary surface of your days. Without announcement, you recognize this. There was no dramatic rupture, no final conversation, no decision made at a particular hour. One morning, the inner machinery simply stopped translating what you felt into what others could receive. It stopped, the way a hand stops reaching when it has learned, not chosen, learned that nothing will meet it. What remained was memory, intact, ordered, precise in ways that would unsettle those who believe the traumatized forget. You do not forget. That is the first fact I would have you sit with before we go anywhere else. Those who carry early wounding in the psyche do not lose their record of events. They lose, over time, the willingness to open that record to those who have shown they will not read it carefully. This is not the same as forgetting. It is closer to archiving. The material is held, the access is revoked. The psychological event that concerns us today has already completed. I say this not to unsettle you, but because to speak of it as still in motion would be a distortion. What happened inside you, this reorganization of the entire emotional apparatus around silence, around memory, around a new relationship to your own interior, is not happening. It happened. You are now living inside its aftermath. I want to examine that aftermath with precision, not with comfort, not with instruction, precision, because you deserve to have the mechanism named clearly, and because naming it without sentimentality is the only form of respect I know how to offer. Let me begin with what others experience when they try to reach you now. They approach, you are present, you are, by every external measure, recognizable as the person they have known. You speak, you respond, you maintain the ordinary surfaces of contact with what appears to be normal continuity, and yet something is different. Something has changed in the quality of the access they have to you. They feel it before they can name it. Some of them become louder, as though volume will reach what proximity cannot. Some of them become more elaborate in their demonstrations of need, as though intensity will open what gentleness could not. Some simply become confused, standing in front of you with the expression of a person who has returned to a building they know well and found all the familiar doors replaced. What they do not understand, what they may never understand, is that this is not a punishment. It is not a strategy. It is not coldness or distance or the particular cruelty of deliberate emotional withholding. It is something far more structural than any of those things. It is the result of a completed reorganization of the psychic interior. And the reorganization was not chosen. It was arrived at. There is a significant difference. I have spent decades watching the psyche arrive at its own conclusions through means that bypass the conscious will entirely. What I have seen in those who carry what I would call the wound of early overperception, those who were required, by the conditions of their earliest years, to read others with a precision that no child should need, is that the psyche does not dismantle this capacity. It deepens it. It refines it to a degree that becomes, with time, both remarkable and isolating. By the time such a person reaches maturity, they have accumulated an interior record of others that those others do not possess about themselves. They have watched, they have remembered, they have catalogued not the dramatic moments alone, but the micro gestures, the patterns in timing, the specific quality of attention others direct at them versus away from them. All of this is retained. What changes, what completed inside you, is the decision about what to do with that record. I must be careful here, because I am using the word decision, and that word implies choice. And I do not want to suggest that what happened was a conscious act of deliberate design. It was not. It was more like a natural conclusion, the way water eventually stops attempting to flow through a passage that has proven itself consistently obstructed, and finds instead the path of its own pooling. The psyche's intelligence operated below your awareness, assessed the return on continued emotional visibility, and completed a quiet revision of its terms. Let us go further into what this wound of early overperception actually is, because I think it is important to understand not just what it produces, but what it requires of the one who carries it. I have written at length about the fundamental asymmetry that develops when a child is forced, very early, into the role of emotional reader within their environment. What I mean by reader is specific, a child who cannot afford the ordinary luxury of being opaque to others' states, who must instead develop an almost instantaneous processing of others' internal conditions as a matter of psychic and sometimes physical safety. This is not empathy in the romanticized sense. That word has been so thoroughly softened by popular use that I hesitate to employ it without qualification. What I am describing is something harder, more involuntary, more exhausting than what that word now implies. It is a survival-grade perceptual system that developed because it had to, because the consequences of failing to read the room, failing to anticipate the shift in atmosphere, the oncoming difficulty, the specific pressure point in another person that was about to destabilize the environment, were consequences the child could not absorb. The system develops, it becomes extraordinarily accurate, and this accuracy does not diminish with age. In my work on the structure of the psyche, I observed again and again that capacities born of early necessity do not simply relax when the necessity is removed. They persist. They become part of the personality's architecture. They continue operating even when the original environment that demanded them is decades past. The child who learned to read has become the adult who cannot stop reading. This is one of the first things I would have you understand about yourself. If you carry this wound, the reading is not a choice you are making in the present. It is a function that is running continuously, producing data continuously. And the data it produces is, by now, so dense and so accurate that it has created a record of the people in your life that has very little resemblance to the stories those people tell about themselves. You know things about the people in your life that they do not know, you know. You have always known this. What changed, what completed inside you is that you stopped indicating it. There was a period, perhaps long, perhaps compressed, in which you still operated from the assumption that visibility was worth attempting, that if you showed others what you perceived, not everything, never everything, but selected portions, offered carefully, something useful would result. Connection, perhaps, or at minimum, a kind of mutual recognition, the sense that another person was willing to know themselves as clearly as you were already seeing them. What accumulated instead was something else, I want to name what that something else is, because naming it requires a kind of precision that popular language does not easily support. It was not primarily betrayal, though betrayal occurred. It was not primarily disappointment, though disappointment was present. What accumulated was something closer to a compound recognition that the precision you brought to others was not being met with equivalent care, that the emotional labor of being seen by you was not prompting those others to examine themselves, but instead to use your perception as a service, a resource, a form of emotional sustenance that they consumed without producing anything comparable in return. I have called this, in various forms throughout my work, the shadow side of the caretaker configuration. The individual who perceives deeply and responds accurately to others' needs becomes, to those others, a kind of psychological nutrient source, not a person, a function. The distinction may seem subtle from the outside. From the inside, it is the distinction between being known and being used, and it is not subtle at all. Now, I want to introduce an image here that I will carry with us across this conversation. I want you to think of a sealed letter, not a letter that has never been written. The writing occurred in full over years, a letter that was written, addressed, and sealed, and then quietly removed from the place where it had been set out to be collected, and placed instead in an interior archive where it will remain indefinitely. This is not the same as the letter never having existed. The letter exists. The content is precise and complete. The intelligence that produced it was real. What changed is the determination of whether it will be delivered. And that determination, that quiet removal from the outbox to the archive, is the psychological event we are examining today. What interests me about this image is what it reveals about the nature of memory in those who carry the wound of early overperception. Because the letter was written from memory, from records kept across years, from observations archived with a care and a completeness that most people simply do not apply to their relational lives, because most people were not required. At the developmental stage, when such systems are formed, to apply it, you remember everything that was said to you that was designed to diminish you. You remember the exact quality of attention you received when you were in crisis versus the quality of attention you received when you were functional and therefore useful. You remember the inconsistencies not because you catalogued them deliberately, but because the perceptual system that was built to keep you safe does not distinguish between important and unimportant data. It archives all of it. The slight pause before the affirmation, the warmth that appeared specifically when you were compliant, the particular formulation used to make your objection feel like a problem with your perception rather than a legitimate response to actual events. All of this is in the archive. None of it has degraded. And this is the thing that those who find themselves on the outside of your silence do not understand when they attempt to reapproach, when they try the various doors and find them closed. They are not encountering stubbornness or damage or a failure of healing. They are encountering the archive. They are encountering the record that was kept with perfect accuracy, and the recognition which also completed, which is also behind you, now that the archive does not support the story they are telling about what happened between you. They remember events in the form most favorable to their self-continuity. This is not malice. It is the ordinary operation of the human psyche's defensive functions, which I have examined at length and which I will not condemn. The psyche protects its own coherence. That is its primary task. Events are reshaped at the level of memory to preserve the self-narrative that allows the individual to continue functioning with tolerable self-regard. You do not have this protection, or rather, you have it in other domains, but in the domain of relational perception, in the domain where the wound was formed and the survival system was built, your memory does not perform. This kind of reshaping, it was not built to protect you from discomfort. It was built to protect you from danger. And the distinction between those two things is one of resolution. A low-resolution system protects you from discomfort by smoothing over inconvenient data. A high-resolution system keeps every pixel intact because it was built for conditions where a missing pixel could be the difference between safety and harm. You carry a high-resolution relational memory, and you are sitting now in the silence that this resolution eventually produced, not because you chose silence, because the archive and the access to you became incompatible, because continued emotional visibility to those whose behavior your archive had fully documented would have required a kind of self-betrayal that the psyche, at some level below, will decline to continue performing. The still water is the second image I want to place before you. Not frozen, not dead, not withdrawn in the sense of depletion or shut down, still in the sense of settled, in the sense of a surface that is no longer disturbed by the attempts of others to read it. Because the currents it follows now run entirely beneath its visible face. We are going to move, as we continue, deeper into the mechanism of this. I want to look at what happens to guilt when access collapses. I want to look at what happens to the roles others assign to you: the healer, the stabilizer, the one who could be counted on to extend understanding regardless of what was deserved, when the infrastructure for those roles simply is no longer available to them. I want to look at two specific dreams that illustrate the structure of what has completed. And I want to examine what it means that what was integrated was not peace, not forgiveness, not acceptance, in the resigned sense of that word, but something considerably more dangerous, and considerably more honest, and considerably more structurally sound. But before we move there, I want to sit for a moment longer in this first recognition that what you are carrying in your silence is not emptiness. It is the accumulated precision of decades of accurate perception. It is a record that has no equivalent in the memories of those who believe they know you. It is the fully realized consequence of a psychic development that began in the earliest years of your life and arrived, at last, at a configuration that could not be anything other than what it now is. The psychological event has completed. You are not in the middle of it. You are on the other side of it. And the question before us now is not how to undo it or explain it or repair what it has altered, but what it means to know, with full clarity, what the archive contains, and what you intend, not what you decide, but what the reorganized psyche has already structured into your going forward to do with that knowledge. What I want to examine now is the question of guilt, because guilt did not disappear when the access collapsed. That would be too clean a resolution. And the psyche does not produce clean resolutions. What happened to guilt was more interesting and more instructive, and I think you have felt it in a form that you may not yet have been able to name precisely. The guilt did not leave. It shifted its object in the period before the reorganization completed, and I want you to understand that this period may have lasted years, may have constituted the majority of your adult relational life. The guilt operated in a very specific direction. It pointed outward, or rather, it pointed at you from the outside, and you received it as if it were coming from within. Others communicated through mechanisms both explicit and extraordinarily subtle, that your perceptions were the source of difficulty, that the discomfort in the room was a product of your sensitivity rather than of the actual events your sensitivity was accurately reading, that the strain in the relationship was caused by your inability to let things go, rather than by the recurring pattern your archive had documented with complete fidelity. This is the particular genius, I use the word without admiration, of a certain kind of relational dynamic. It does not require deliberate cruelty. It does not require a conscious strategy of blame shifting. It operates through the ordinary, largely unconscious, psychic mechanism by which people who are not equipped to examine their own behavior redirect the discomfort produced by that behavior toward the person most likely to absorb it. And the person most likely to absorb it is the one who has been trained since earliest development to believe that others' discomfort is both her responsibility and, in some foundational way, her fault. You absorbed it for years. Perhaps you took the guilt and you turned it inward, and you refined your own behavior, and you made yourself smaller in specific ways and more available in others. And you searched your own record for the evidence that would confirm you were the problem, because if you were the problem was within your power to correct, and if it was within your power to correct, then the environment was not as dangerous as the archive suggested. I have seen this mechanism more times than I can count. In my work on the development of personality, I observed again and again that the child who learned to be responsible for others' emotional states does not easily relinquish that responsibility in adulthood. Even when the evidence accumulated in the archive contradicts the story that the responsibility is legitimate, because to relinquish it would mean accepting an alternative explanation, and the alternative explanation that others are behaving in ways that cause harm, deliberately or not, and that you are not the origin of that harm is, paradoxically, more threatening than the self-blame. Self-blame, however painful, preserves the illusion of control. If I am the cause, I can be the correction. If they are the cause, I am subject to forces I cannot adjust from within. So the guilt was retained, pointed inward, used as evidence of your deficiency rather than as evidence of theirs. What happened? In the completion of the reorganization we are examining is that this direction reversed, not explosively, not with the drama of confrontation or the release of a long withheld accusation. The reversal was quiet. It was almost administrative in its quality. The archive simply reached a density at which the self-blame explanation required too many contradictions to sustain itself. And the psyche again, below the level of conscious decision, stopped sustaining it. The guilt did not vanish. I want to be precise about this. It did not resolve into forgiveness or peace or the particular soft settling that popular accounts of healing tend to describe. What happened was more structural. The guilt that had been pointed at you turned and pointed at its actual object. And what lives now in that redirected guilt is something you may still be finding difficult to sit with because it is not comfortable, and it is not kind, and it bears no resemblance to the emotional posture that was expected of you. What lives there is accurate assessment. The archive consulted, the evidence reviewed, and a conclusion reached that is not harsh but is honest, that certain people in your life took more than they brought, knew less about you than you knew about them, and relied on your continued emotional labor in ways they did not acknowledge and will not acknowledge now. The guilt, redirected, became something close to what I have elsewhere described as the integration of the moral shadow. The shadow, and I use this term in the precise sense in which I developed it, not in the popular usage that has diluted it significantly, is not simply the dark or the difficult. The shadow is the disowned. It is everything the conscious personality cannot accommodate within its self-presentation. For those who carry the wound of early overperception and who have organized their visible self around availability, carry, and the suppression of their own needs, the shadow holds a specific and powerful content. It holds anger, not rage, though rage may have appeared briefly at certain threshold moments. Anger in the structural sense, the clear, cold recognition that something unjust occurred and was sustained across time, and that the injustice was not accidental but was in some way relied upon by those who benefited from it. It holds assessment, the capacity to evaluate others without the softening impulse, to see behavior for exactly what it is without immediately constructing the most charitable interpretation, without running the automatic routine that explains away the pattern in favor of the exception. And it holds, this is perhaps the most significant, the boundary as a structural fact rather than as a moral performance. I want to dwell on this distinction because I think it is central to what has completed inside you, and because the difference between these two things is the difference between a temporary adjustment and a permanent reorganization. When a boundary is a moral performance, it is enacted as a statement, it is communicated, explained, justified, negotiated. It has an audience. Its existence depends in some sense on the acknowledgement of those to whom it is directed. If they do not acknowledge it, if they push against it, ignore it, reframe it as your failure of compassion or your emotional unavailability or your damage, the boundary is at risk. Because it was built to be seen, and when it is not seen in the intended way, the scaffolding on which it rests begins to weaken. When a boundary is a structural fact, it requires none of this. It is not a statement made to anyone. It is the simple result of the reorganization of the interior. Access has been revised. Emotional availability has been rerouted. The infrastructure for certain kinds of contact no longer exists in its previous form. There is nothing to explain because there is nothing to persuade anyone of. The building has been reconfigured from within, and whether the people who previously used certain rooms understand why those rooms are no longer accessible to them is entirely beside the point. This is what others are encountering when they try the various doors and find them closed, not a decision you made about them specifically. not a punishment, however much it may feel like one from their side. A structural fact: the reorganized interior does not provide what it previously provided, not because the provision was deliberately withdrawn, but because the mechanism that produced it operated from a specific set of conditions that no longer exist. Now I want to introduce the first dream. It came in one form or another to several people I worked with across my years of practice. Though the specific imagery differed with each, in its essential architecture, it goes like this. You are in a house that you know to be yours, though it does not resemble any house you have lived in. The rooms are many. You move through them with familiarity and ease. There are others in the house, familiar figures, though in the dream logic they may not bear the faces of specific people. These others are searching, they are opening doors, looking for something, moving from room to room with increasing urgency. You watch them, they do not find what they are looking for. At some point, you realize, with a clarity that carries no emotion, that what they are searching for was never in those rooms, that it was moved. At some point, you cannot precisely identify to a room they cannot locate, a room that does not appear on any internal map they hold. You do not tell them, not out of cruelty, out of the simple recognition that telling them would not help them find it, because the capacity to find it is not a function of information, it is a function of a different kind of attention than they are currently capable of directing. You wake from this dream without distress. That is diagnostically important. The absence of distress is not the absence of significance. It is the signal that the dream is not producing anxiety because the interior event it represents is not a conflict in progress. It is a completed fact that the dreaming mind is, for the first time, simply depicting the house is the psyche. The rooms that others cannot find are the rooms that were reorganized in the completion. And the thing they are looking for, the emotional access, the translucent availability, the unconditional comprehensibility they previously relied upon, is not hidden from them out of intent. It is reorganized into a structure they do not have the perceptual equipment to navigate, because navigating it would require exactly the quality of attention that the wound of early over-perception produced in you, and which was not produced in them, because they were not required at the developmental stage when such systems form to develop it. This asymmetry is not a wound you carry alone. It is a structural feature of the relational situation you have lived inside. And its consequence, the consequence that has completed, is a specific, quiet, permanent form of solitude that is unlike loneliness in almost every respect. Loneliness is the pain of wanted contact that is absent. What you carry is something different. It is the settled recognition that the contact that was previously available was never, in fact, the contact it appeared to be, that what others experienced as connection was something closer to service, that the warmth they felt in your presence was in large part a function of your reading them accurately and reflecting them usefully back to themselves, and that this function, however it felt to them, was not the same as being known. Being known requires the other person to do the work of seeing, requires them to direct their attention toward you with the same quality of precision and patience that you have always directed toward them. And the archive tells you, has always told you, was built to tell you precisely how often that actually happened. Now, I want to examine what collapsed when the access collapsed. Because the access did not exist in isolation, it was threaded through a series of roles that others had assigned, often very early in the relationship, and which functioned as the primary structure through which those relationships were organized. The roles are familiar to you. You do not need me to list them in full, but I want to name the architecture they share, because the architecture is what is relevant here, not the specific variations in label. Every role that was assigned to you organized itself around a single fundamental premise that your primary relational function was oriented toward others rather than toward yourself. Healer, stabilizer, the one who could be counted on to understand, to not react badly, to hold the difficult material without dropping it, to remain accessible in precisely the moments when other people collapse their access to one another, the one who, when her own difficulty was present, managed it quietly enough that it did not become a burden, the one whose need, if it surfaced at all, surfaced in forms that were small enough and well-timed enough to be accommodated without genuine disruption to anyone else's internal weather. What is important to understand about these roles is not that they were imposed by force. They were not. They were arrived at through a long, subtle, largely unconscious process of mutual calibration in which your particular capacities met others' particular needs. And the fit was so precise that neither party had to examine the terms. You were good at it. They benefited from it. The arrangement stabilized around its own functionality. What is also important to understand is what these roles required you to keep in the shadow. Because every role that organizes itself around the premise of other orientation requires, as its shadow content, the self-orientation that was not included in the arrangement, the anger at the asymmetry, the perception of others' behavior that you were required to soften and qualify and translate into something more manageable before it could be expressed, the needs that did not surface because the relational architecture had no room for them. All of this was not processed, it was archived, and the archive, as I have said, does not degrade. What happened when the reorganization completed is that the shadow content was no longer suppressed by the energy required to maintain the roles, because the roles themselves were no longer being performed, not because you decided to stop performing them, but because the psychic infrastructure on which the performance depended, the continued willingness to extend access, to translate perception into care, to make yourself emotionally available to those whose record in the archive did not warrant. It simply was no longer operating in its previous configuration. The roles collapsed because the infrastructure collapsed. And what became visible in the collapse was the shadow content that had accumulated across the years of the role's maintenance. The scar that no longer aches. That is the third image I want to place before you. And I want to be precise about what I mean by it. A scar is the completed form of a wound. It is not the wound in process. It does not bleed. It is not sensitive in the same register as living tissue. It is, in fact, considerably stronger than the original tissue it replaced. This is not metaphor for resilience in the popular sense. It is a description of what happens structurally when the wound response system completes its work and the psyche forms over the site of damage with a material that is denser, less permeable, and less available to re-injury than what was there before. You carry this now in the domain of your relational perception, the site where access was previously unrestricted, where others could reach the emotional interior with relatively low effort, where your availability was the default configuration and its withdrawal required active justification. That site has scarred. It is not open in the way it was. It is not sensitive to the same stimuli in the same way. And it is considerably harder to damage than it was before. This is not a loss. I want to be careful here, because I know that the cultural narrative, the popular account of what healing looks like, what recovered looks like, what a psychologically healthy person looks like, tends to position this kind of scar tissue as a problem to be dissolved rather than a structure to be respected. The prescription in that narrative is warmth, openness, the gradual return of vulnerability, the courageous re-extension of access to those who have demonstrated willingness to receive it carefully. I am not offering that prescription. What I am offering is this: the scar is accurate. The reduced permeability is accurate. The reorganization of the interior around a configuration that requires considerably more from others before extending the access they previously received for almost nothing. This is accurate. It is the psyche's most honest and most structurally sound response to the record the archive contains. We have not yet looked at what happens to the ordinary instruments of emotional coercion when the access collapses. We have not yet looked at the second dream. We have not yet examined what the integration of the shadow content actually produced in the day-to-day texture of your relational life and in the specific quality of your solitude. We have not yet looked at what it means that the silence does not resolve. But before we move there, I want to sit with what I have just said about accuracy, because accuracy is the thread that runs through everything we are examining today, and it is, I think, the quality that most distinguishes what has completed inside you from what popular accounts of trauma and healing tend to describe. The popular account treats the protective system, the perceptual precision, the archive, the scar tissue as a symptom to be managed until it can be relinquished. It treats the silence as a stage to be moved through. It treats the collapse of access as a wound to be healed until access can be restored. I am telling you that this account misidentifies the nature of what occurred. What occurred was not damage requiring repair. What occurred was the completion of a developmental process that began in the conditions of your earliest environment and has arrived, across decades of psychological labor, at its mature and accurate form. The silence is not a symptom, it is a structure. The archive is not a trauma response frozen in time. It is a perceptual system that has been operating with precision and good faith across the whole of your life, producing accurate data, and has finally been extended the credibility of its own conclusions. What has completed inside you is not shut down. It is clarity, and we are going to continue in the movement ahead into exactly what that clarity contains, and what it costs, and what it has made permanently impossible, not as a warning, but as a fact, which is the only form in which I am willing to offer it. Now I want to examine what happens to the ordinary instruments of emotional coercion when the access collapses. Because they do not stop being deployed, I want to be clear about this. The people who previously relied on your emotional availability do not, upon finding the doors closed, simply accept the new configuration and adjust their behavior accordingly. That would require a level of self-examination that the same psychic defensive structures which prevented them from seeing the asymmetry in the first place will continue to prevent. What they do instead is reach for the instruments, and the instruments are specific, and you know them. And I want to name them without softening because they have been used on you long enough that they deserve to be seen clearly. The first instrument is guilt by consequence. It does not say you are wrong to have changed. It says, look at what your change is producing, look at the pain it is causing, look at how difficult things have become since you became less available. The instrument does not acknowledge that the pain it is pointing to is the pain of losing access to something that was never freely given but was extracted at considerable cost over a long period. It presents the pain as evidence of your wrongdoing rather than as the natural discomfort of a system adjusting to the removal of something it had been consuming without adequate reciprocity. You have felt this. The weight of it is particular. It does not arrive with the blunt force of accusation. It arrives with the softer, more penetrating quality of implication, of the pained expression held a moment too long, of the question asked in a tone that embeds the answer, of the reference to how things used to be, delivered in a register that makes the past sound like a standard you have failed to maintain. The archive has documented all of it, every iteration, every variation, the specific formulation used when direct accusation proved ineffective and was therefore replaced by this more refined approach. The timing, the way this instrument is most often deployed, not in the middle of an ordinary interaction, but precisely at the moment when your withdrawal is most visible, most recently enacted, most difficult to defend in the face of another person's expressed suffering. What changed when the reorganization completed is not that the instrument ceased to land, it is that what it landed on changed. Previously, it landed on the active guilt system, the inward-pointed guilt I described earlier, the guilt that had been trained to receive exactly this kind of input and convert it immediately into self-examination and behavioral correction. That system has been revised. The inward-pointed guilt is no longer the first responder. What receives the instrument now is the archive, and the archive does not process guilt by consequence as evidence of wrongdoing. It processes it as data. It notes the pattern. It cross-references the timing. It observes the specific relationship between the deployment of this instrument and the degree of access withdrawal that immediately preceded it. And it files the observation alongside the thousands of prior observations that constitute its record of this person and this dynamic. This is what I mean when I say the silence remembers everything. The silence is not passive. It is not empty. It is the archive in its operational state, receiving all input, classifying all input, and declining to convert that input into the behavioral outputs that were previously expected. The second instrument is the redefinition of your change as pathology. This one is more sophisticated and more damaging when it lands, because it appropriates the language of psychological concern. It does not say you have become cold. It says, I am worried about you. It does not say you are withholding what I need. It says, you seem shut down. You seem like you are not yourself. You seem like you might benefit from speaking to someone about why you have become so distant. The instrument weaponizes the genuine vocabulary of psychological health, of openness, of integration, of the danger of isolation, and deploys it in service of the argument that your reorganization is a symptom rather than an arrival. I want you to notice the specific form of this instrument's cruelty, which is that it takes something true and inverts its application. It is true that isolation can be a symptom of unprocessed trauma. It is true that the collapse of emotional access can represent a shutdown rather than a completion. It is true that genuine psychological health is not the same as impenetrability. All of these things are true. What the instrument does is take these truths and apply them to your situation in service of a conclusion that the archive contradicts, that your particular form of quiet, your particular withdrawal of access, is a malfunction requiring correction rather than an accuracy requiring respect. The difference between a shutdown and a completion is precisely what I have been attempting to describe throughout this entire conversation. And I do not think I can reduce it to a single distinguishing feature that would settle the question for anyone who is not willing to consult the archive honestly. But there is one marker that I have come to trust across decades of clinical observation, and it is this: in a shutdown, the interior is also inaccessible to the person who carries it. The numbing that characterizes genuine traumatic dissociation cuts in both directions, not only outward, toward others, but inward, away from one's own experience. What I am describing in your case is the opposite configuration. The interior is more accessible to you than it has ever been. The self-knowledge is clear. The emotional range is intact and operative. What has collapsed is not your access to yourself. It is others' access to you. That is not a shutdown. That is a boundary in the structural sense. And the people deploying the second instrument know, at some level below their conscious deployment of it, that there is a difference. The anxiety that drives the instrument is not the anxiety of genuine concern for your well-being. It is the anxiety of a system that relied on your accessibility and is now experiencing the consequences of that reliance being withdrawn. The third instrument is the appeal to your own values. This is the most refined and in some ways the most difficult to receive without response, because it does not attack from outside. It enters through the interior. It says, but you care about people. It says, but you have always believed in the importance of not giving up on those you love. It says, is this really who you are? Is this the person you want to be? Someone who closes herself off, who lets wounds define her limits, who mistakes self-protection for strength. The instrument knows the value system. It has had years to learn it. It knows that you do not want to be defined by damage. It knows that you hold genuine convictions about the importance of honesty in relationship, about not performing coldness as a defense, about the difference between boundaries as authentic structure and boundaries as armor that replicates the wounding it was built to prevent. The instrument takes these genuine convictions and leverages them against the very reorganization those convictions actually support. Because here is what the instrument misunderstands, or pretends to misunderstand. The reorganization is not a betrayal of your values. It is their fullest expression. The commitment to honesty that has always characterized your relational life is precisely what the archive reflects. The refusal to perform care you do not feel, availability you have not offered, access you have not extended, is not the abandonment of your values. It is their application to the relationship you have with yourself. The people who deploy this instrument are, in a specific sense, correct that you have changed. What they cannot accept, what the instrument is designed to prevent you from accepting, is that the change is not away from who you are but toward it. Now, I want to introduce the second dream. It is quieter than the first, less architectural. It has in it no searching figures, no urgent movement, no sense of stakes. In its essential form, you are sitting somewhere at a table, in a room, beside water, and you are writing. The writing is not effortful. It arrives with the quality of dictation rather than composition, as though the material has been waiting, fully formed, and you are simply transferring it from one medium to another. You cannot see, in the dream, what you are writing. You know only that it is precise, that it contains, in a form you cannot read with the ordinary eye, the full record, everything observed, everything archived, everything that was seen and held and never delivered. There is, in the dream, no audience, no recipient, no intent to send. You wake with a feeling not of relief, not of resolution, but of something that I can only describe as rightness. The specific quality of rightness that attends an action that is aligned with the actual structure of one's situation rather than with the structure others have constructed around one. The writing in the dream is the archive in its most honest form. It is not testimony prepared for a hearing. It is not a letter drafted for delivery. It is the record as record existing because it exists, because the perceptual system that produced it did its work with fidelity, because precision is its own justification and requires no external ratification. What the dream tells us about the completion we are examining is this: the archive is no longer being held in tension with the desire to deliver it. The yearning which may have occupied years of your relational life to have the record acknowledged, to have someone look at what you saw and say, yes, that is what happened. I see it too. I see what you carried. I see what the asymmetry cost you. That yearning has not been fulfilled. It has been relinquished, not in despair, in the specific quiet of a person who has recognized that the ratification she was seeking was never the point, that the record is accurate whether or not it is ever acknowledged, that the precision holds whether or not any external witness ever confirms it. This relinquishment is not the same as giving up. I want to be careful here because the distinction is significant. Giving up implies that the thing relinquished was worth having and its absence is a loss. What I am describing is the recognition that the thing relinquished the need for external confirmation of what the archive contains was never actually serving you. It was serving the dynamic. It was the final cord connecting you to the relational configuration that the reorganization completed. And its relinquishment was not a defeat. It was the last movement of the completion itself. Let me now turn to something I have been approaching from several directions and want to address with more directness. The shadow content that was released when the roles collapsed is not entirely comfortable material. I have mentioned anger and accurate assessment, and the boundary as structure, but there is a fourth element in the shadow content of those who carry this particular wound and this particular configuration, and I have found it in my clinical work to be the most disorienting to encounter when it first becomes visible. It is not violent, it is not destructive, but it has the quality of something that the personality's previous organization could not have accommodated. And its sudden visibility in the interior landscape can produce a form of vertigo that is unlike any of the more familiar forms of psychological distress. It is indifference, not the performed indifference of someone trying to appear unaffected, not the brittle indifference of someone working very hard not to care, the genuine article, a settled, quiet, non-hostile absence of investment in whether certain people do or do not understand what has happened, whether they do or do not feel the impact of the new configuration, whether they do or do not eventually arrive at a reckoning with their own part in the dynamic. I have written elsewhere about the relationship between deep care and its shadow, which is not hatred but precisely this, the cessation of care that has no anger in it, because anger still requires investment. Anger still turns toward its object. Anger is, in a certain precise sense, still a form of relation. What I am describing is the form that follows anger when anger has been fully processed and integrated, when the moral shadow has been not suppressed but metabolized. What remains is not warmth and not hostility. It is a kind of clear, clean neutrality in which the other person exists, continues to exist, and their existence produces in you neither the longing nor the resentment that would indicate continued psychological entanglement. This is, I think, the aspect of the completion that is most difficult for others to accept. Not the closed doors, those can be explained, perhaps as pain, as temporary withdrawal, as an understandable, if excessive, response to genuine harm, but the indifference behind the closed doors cannot be explained in a way that the other person can use to position themselves as the one working to repair things. It does not give them a role, it does not give them a path, it does not offer even the dignity of being hated, which at least confirms that you are still organized around them in some functional sense. The indifference simply is, and it is one of the most honest things the psyche ever produces. Now, I want to look at what the texture of your daily life actually looks like inside this completion, because I think there is a tendency, when describing what I have been describing, to make it sound more dramatic in its day-to-day manifestation than it actually is. The interior reorganization we are examining does not produce visible rupture. It does not announce itself in the social fabric of your life through dramatic gesture or public declaration. It is almost entirely invisible from the outside, except in the specific register of those who were previously relying on the access and are now finding it absent. What it looks like from the inside is something considerably quieter and considerably more ordinary than the magnitude of the psychological event would suggest. You move through your days with a specific quality of self-possession that is new, not confidence in the motivational sense, not the performance of capability and directedness, something quieter. The absence of the low-grade internal monitoring that previously ran continuously beneath your surface engagement with the world, the monitoring of others' states, of room temperature, of whether the level of care you were currently extending was adequate to what the situation seemed to require. That monitoring is still present as a perceptual capacity. The system has not been decommissioned, but it is no longer running in service of the anxiety that previously powered it. It is running, when it runs, from a different source, from interest, from choice, from the occasional genuine desire to understand another person's interior rather than from the compulsive obligation to manage it. This distinction between perception running from anxiety and perception running from interest is perhaps the most concrete way I can describe what has changed in your daily experience. The perceptual capacity is the same. The volume of data it produces is comparable. The accuracy has not diminished. What has changed is the relationship you have to what it produces. Previously, the data arrived with urgency and obligation attached. You saw other states and you were immediately implicated in them, immediately responsible for responding to them, immediately in the position of having to decide how much of what you perceived you could safely acknowledge without disturbing the arrangement. Now the data arrives and you simply have it. You hold it. You decide from a position of actual choice rather than compulsive necessity. What, if anything, you wish to do with it. The still water, in this sense, is not the absence of depth. It is the depth's new relationship to its own surface. Previously, the surface was perpetually disturbed by the winds of others' needs and states and the obligations your perceptual system generated in response to them. Now the surface is still not because the depth has emptied, but because the depth has found a different relationship to what passes over it. It receives the weather, it registers the weather, it is not driven by the weather. I want to speak briefly about what this reorganization means for those who are still present in your life, not those who relied on the old access and are now finding it closed, but those with whom the relationship has a different quality, because the completion we are examining did not produce total withdrawal from relational life. It produced a radical revision of the terms on which relational engagement occurs. What you now extend when you extend it is something qualitatively different from what was previously available. Previously, what you extended was, in part, produced by the anxiety of the perceptual system and its compulsive orientation toward others' needs. What you extend now is produced only when the genuine desire for contact is present, and its quality reflects this origin. It is less continuous. It is less predictable by the rhythms of others' needs. But when it is present, it is entirely present, not managed, not calibrated for what the other person requires, not translated through the filter of obligation before delivery. Some people in your life will find this more difficult than the previous configuration. It makes fewer accommodations for their comfort. It requires more from them in the way of actually bringing themselves to the encounter rather than relying on your perceptual generosity to carry the weight of mutual understanding. Those people will feel, perhaps, that you have become harder to be with, less warm, less available in the specific way they found valuable. Other people will find it, for the first time, like actual contact with an actual person. That distinction between those who find the new configuration less hospitable and those who find it, for the first time, real is itself a kind of diagnostic. It tells you something precise and important about the nature of what each of those relationships has been. And the archive, of course, already knew. We are approaching the final movement of what I want to examine with you. Before we arrive there, I want to place before you once more the three images we have been carrying: the sealed letter, the still water, the scar that no longer aches. I want you to notice that none of these images is an image of ending. The letter exists, the water has depth, the scar is living tissue. None of them is an image of emptiness or depletion or the kind of psychic exhaustion that popular accounts of trauma tend to place at the center of the story. They are images of completion, of density, of material that has arrived at the form most appropriate to its nature. And I want to sit with that word appropriate for a moment before we continue. Because what completed inside you is not, despite how it may sometimes feel in the quiet hours, a diminishment. It is not less than what existed before. It is differently organized. It is organized around a center that is internal rather than relational, around a record that is accurate rather than comforting, around a silence that contains everything rather than a visibility that offered everything and received almost nothing in return. The question we will take up in the final movement is not what this completion cost you. The archive knows what it cost. The question is what it has made structurally possible, not in the optimistic sense of doors opening and new horizons emerging, but in the precise, cold, honest sense of what configurations of living become available when the psyche has been reorganized around its own accuracy rather than around the management of others' comfort. That is where we are going. And I will not prepare you for it. I will simply take you there. What the completion has made structurally possible is not happiness. I want to say this first, plainly, because the temptation, even in a conversation as carefully calibrated as this one is, to arrive at the final movement with something that resembles resolution in the consoling sense. Something that suggests the difficulty was worth it, that the cost produced a proportionate return, that the reorganization of the interior has delivered you to a life that is in some measurable way better than the one that preceded it. I am not going to offer that, not because it is false in every particular, but because the framing of better and worse is not adequate to what has actually occurred. What has occurred is not an improvement. It is a transformation in the specific sense that the material has changed its fundamental organization. And the new organization is not superior to the old one in the way that a repaired object is superior to a broken one. It is simply different in kind, and some of what it is different in kind from was genuinely valuable, and its loss is a real loss, and I will not pretend otherwise. What you lost in the completion is the particular form of intimacy that is only available to those who have not yet learned what the archive eventually teaches. The intimacy of extension without history, of offering without full knowledge of the record. There is a specific quality of contact that belongs to the period before the archive reaches critical density, before the pattern is so thoroughly documented, that the documentation itself changes the nature of every new encounter with that pattern. That quality of contact is not available to you in the same form anymore, not with those whose record is already complete, not with the specific texture of unknowing that made certain kinds of vulnerability feel worth their cost. That is a loss. I name it as a loss without minimizing it. What remains, and what the reorganization has made structurally possible, is something I want to describe with the same precision I have been attempting throughout this conversation. The first thing it has made possible is a relationship to your own perception that is no longer organized around the question of its acceptability to others. This sounds simple. It is not. The perceptual system we have been examining, the high-resolution, archive-generating, pattern-detecting system that was built in the earliest years of your life, has spent the majority of its operational existence in a particular kind of tension. The tension between what it produces and what the social environment was willing to receive, between what you saw and what could be safely said to have been seen, between the accuracy of your record and the version of events that others required you to endorse in order for the relationship to continue functioning. This tension is not a minor feature of the psychology we are examining. It is, in my view, one of the most corrosive forces available to the human interior. To possess a perceptual system of genuine accuracy and to be required repeatedly across years to edit its outputs for palatability, to translate what you see into what others can hear without disruption to their self-narrative, is to create, over time, a specific form of internal fracture, not dramatic, not the fracture of breakdown or crisis. The quiet, persistent fracture of a person who knows one thing and is required to act as though she knows another. What the reorganization completed is the closing of this fracture, not through confrontation, not through the delivery of the unedited record to those who produced the need to edit it, through the simple cessation of the editing process itself. The archive now exists in the interior in its unedited form, and your relationship to it is direct. You know what you know. You no longer perform uncertainty about what you have documented with precision. You no longer construct the most charitable interpretation as a reflex before you are able to access your own honest assessment. The perception and the acknowledgement of the perception have become continuous rather than interrupted by the translation process. This continuity between what you perceive and what you are willing to know you perceive is what I would call, in the language of my work on the development of personality, the beginning of genuine individuation, not its completion. Its beginning, because individuation is not an event, it is a direction, and the direction it requires is precisely the one that the reorganization has made structurally possible, to the direction of the interior as the primary reference point rather than the external relational field. I have written in various forms that the journey toward the self requires the ego to relinquish its organization around external confirmation. What I mean by this, in the precise context of what we are examining, is that the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, which is not identical to the conscious personality, and which operates on a longer time scale and with a broader scope than the ego's management of daily social life, the self does not organize itself around being understood by others. It organizes itself around being consistent with its own nature, and the ego, in the process of individuation, must learn to take its bearings from that consistency rather than from the approval or comprehension or relational confirmation that it previously required in order to feel stable. What the completion produced is a version of this. The ego's primary reference has shifted. It is no longer primarily checking itself against the relational field, against what others are perceiving, what others are requiring, what the current state of access to you is doing to the emotional weather of those around you. It is checking itself against the archive, against the interior record, against what is actually true about the situation as documented by the most accurate perceptual instrument available. This shift is not comfortable in the way that the word comfort is ordinarily used. It produces a specific quality of solitude that I want to describe carefully because I think it is frequently mischaracterized both by those who carry it and by those who observe it from outside. The solitude produced by this shift is not loneliness with its suffering muted. It is not isolation that has been rationalized into acceptability. It is not the brave face of someone who has been left and is pretending that departure was a choice. It is a genuine and particular quality of being with oneself that has no adequate social vocabulary. Because the social vocabulary for solitude was developed primarily by people whose solitude was a deprivation rather than an arrival. What it feels like from inside is closer to this, a quality of interior spaciousness that was not available when the interior was constantly organized around others' needs and states. A quality of attention that can rest on things, on your own thoughts, on the actual texture of your experience in a given moment, on the specific quality of what is present rather than on the management of what is required, without immediately being redirected toward the relational monitoring that previously consumed it. Not always, not perfectly. The old system still activates in certain conditions, still produces its automatic outputs in certain environments, but the default configuration has changed. The resting state is now interior rather than relational, and in that interior resting state, something has become available that was not available before. Not wisdom in the portentous sense, something more ordinary and more significant, the ability to be present to your own experience as experience rather than as material, to be processed in service of the relational field. I want to place before you now the final image of the three we have been carrying, and look at it one more time from this angle, the scar that no longer aches. I said earlier that a scar is stronger than the original tissue. I want to add something to that now. A scar is also a record. It is visible to those who know how to read such things as documentation of what occurred at that site, not as damage requiring explanation, as history requiring only acknowledgement. The scar does not ask to be understood. It does not require the person who produced the wound to recognize what they produced. It exists independently of any witness. It holds, in its density and its particular configuration, the full record of the event that formed it. You carry this in the domain of your relational history. The history does not require ratification. The record does not require delivery. The archive is not waiting for someone to read it before it can be considered real. It is real, it is complete, it is as accurate as the perceptual system that produced it. And that system is the most sophisticated relational instrument you possess. What the completion made possible, finally, is this: you can live from inside the accuracy of the record without requiring the record to be confirmed, challenged, or responded to by anyone outside the interior. This is not closure in the popular sense. Closure implies a door shut on something that is thereby finished, resolved, placed behind you. What I am describing is not the placing of anything behind you. The archive is not behind you. The history is not behind you. The people whose records are complete are not behind you in the sense of having been left in a location you have departed. They are simply no longer in a position to determine your access to yourself. That distinction between leaving and reorganizing is the precise distinction between damage and completion. The damaged person leaves because she cannot stay. The completed person reorganizes because the previous configuration was no longer consistent with what she actually knows. You know what you know, that is, in the end, the whole of what has completed. Now I want to say something about the future. Not in the prognostic sense, not what will happen, not what you should do, not what the reorganization will eventually produce in terms of relational life or inner peace, or any of the other destinations that healing narratives require. Something more precise than that. What the future contains, in the structure of what has completed, is not repair. There is a question that those who find your access closed tend to carry, tend to present, in various formulations, as the central question of your situation. The question is, can this be repaired? Can the access be restored? Can the relationship return to what it was, or to some version that is adequate? This question assumes that the completion is a rupture in something that was fundamentally intact, and that the correct response to the rupture is the work of restoration. The archive knows that the premise is wrong. What existed before the completion was not fundamentally intact. It was a functional arrangement organized around a significant asymmetry, sustained by the energy of your continued performance of the roles the asymmetry required. And the completion was not a rupture in something healthy, but the cessation of something that was extracting a cost that the psyche eventually declined to continue paying. You cannot repair something by returning it to the configuration that made the reorganization necessary. You can only build something new from the actual conditions that now exist. And the actual conditions that now exist include an archive that is complete, an access that is permanently revised, a perceptual system that is no longer operating in service of the anxiety that previously drove it, and a silence that is not waiting to be broken. The silence is not waiting to be broken. I want to say this directly because I think it is the aspect of the completion that is most consistently misread by those on the outside of it, and occasionally by those on the inside as well. The silence is not a phase. It is not a posture adopted while something else resolves itself beneath the surface. It is not the held breath before the eventual exhale of explanation or confrontation, or the long-deferred conversation in which the record is finally delivered and acknowledged. The silence is the structure. It is what the reorganization produced when it completed. And it will persist, not because you are withholding something that you will eventually release, not because you are waiting for something that has not yet arrived, but because the interior has organized itself around accuracy rather than around the relational expectation of eventual transparency. And accuracy, in this case, does not require speech. Let me say something now about what it means to live forward from this. Living forward from the completion does not mean living in isolation, though some degree of increased solitude is a structural feature of the new configuration. It does not mean the permanent absence of genuine connection. Though genuine connection now operates from different premises and requires different things from those who seek it with you, it does not mean the foreclosure of intimacy. though the form of intimacy that is now available is considerably more demanding and considerably less forgiving of the asymmetries that characterized the previous form. What it means at its most concrete is this: the interior has become the primary country. Everything else, the social world, the relational field, the various arenas of engagement with others, exists as territory you move through, sometimes with genuine interest and investment, sometimes with the detached precision of a traveler who knows the landscape well but carries a different map than the locals. The primary country is interior. The primary navigation is by the archive. The primary allegiance is to what is actually known rather than to what is socially required to be performed as known. This is not a small thing. In a social world organized almost entirely around the performance of legibility, around the expectation that one will make oneself available to be read, understood, responded to, incorporated into others' narratives of the relationship, the person whose primary country is interior and whose allegiance is to the archive rather than to the performance of accessibility represents a specific kind of disruption. Not because she intends disruption, because her organizational principle is different from the one the social world assumes. She is not organized around being understood. She is organized around understanding, and the difference between those two orientations, when they meet, produces exactly the configuration we have been examining all along: the empath, who can read everything and whose interior remains, in its depth and its completeness and its absolute fidelity to the record, fundamentally and permanently beyond the reach of those who were accustomed to reading her in return. I have called this, in the movement of this lecture, many things: the collapse of access, the reorganization of the interior, the completion of the psychological event, the shadow integrated into structure, the archive that does not degrade, the silence that holds everything. All of these names point at the same fact from different angles, and the fact, stated as plainly as I am capable of stating it, is this: what has completed inside you is the final relinquishment of the premise that your interior is owed to anyone who asks for it. That premise which was installed early, which was maintained at considerable cost, which was the operational foundation of the roles you were assigned and the relational dynamics you were required to sustain, is gone, not suppressed, not temporarily suspended, structurally dismantled, in the slow, thorough way that only the psyche's own intelligence, working below the level of conscious decision across years of accumulated evidence, is capable of dismantling something that was installed at the level of foundational belief. The dismantling is complete. The new structure stands in its place. It is not soft. It is not permeable in the ways that the old structure was. It does not offer the same access points. It does not generate the same legibility. It does not produce, in those who encounter it, the comfortable sense of a person who is available to be known on their timeline and in the manner they prefer. What it produces, in those rare people capable of receiving it, is the encounter with someone who knows exactly what she knows, holds it without apology, and extends genuine contact only when genuine contact is what is actually present. The record is complete. The archive is sealed. The silence is the structure. and the structure holds. What completed inside you was not a wound finding its way to healing. It was a witness, finally, coming to rest in her own testimony.